One of the important concepts in building psychologically healthy and safe culture is cultural competence. We'll talk about what organizations should consider when seeking to be psychologically healthy and safe for Jewish members. Up next on this episode of the Psych Health and Safety USA podcast. From Flourish DX, this is the Psych Health and Safety USA podcast. As workplace mental health has become a global priority, there's a greater focus on addressing psychosocial hazards. Each week, we look at psychological safety from an occupational health and safety perspective. Let's talk psychological health and safety. Welcome to this week's Psych Health and Safety USA podcast. I'm your host, Dr. I. David Daniels, and I want to thank you for tuning in. Each week, we seek to increase awareness of the importance of psychological health and safety by learning from the lived experiences, research, and expertise of our guests, as well as advocating strategies to reduce harm and minimize vulnerability to psychosocial hazards in the American workplace. So as of 2023, the world's core Jewish population, those identifying as Jews above all else, was estimated at 15.7 million, or approximately 0.2% of the 8 billion worldwide population. According to 2020 Pew Research, the Jewish population in the United States is estimated to be at about 7.5 million, or 2.5% of the national population. So this includes 5 million adults who identify as Jewish by religion, 1.5 million Jews who identify with no religion, but they identify as Jewish. So the study also found that Jewish adults are geographically distributed. 38% live in the Northeast, 27% live in the South, 25% live in the West, and 10% live in the Midwest. So it can be a matter of religion, and for religious purposes, being Jewish is traditionally defined as being born to a Jewish mother. But being Jewish can also be a matter of ancestry, ethnicity, or culture. So this episode is intended to be a cultural deep dive to answer the question how an organization can create a psychologically healthy and safe environment for someone who's Jewish. So wonderfully, I have the opportunity to talk to someone who knows a lot about that. Someone I met in a get together a while back. And I thought it would be wonderful to have this conversation. So we're going to start the conversation, as I so often do, with an introduction of my guest by my guest with this question. Who is Dr. Robyn Faintich?
Great question. It's a pleasure to be here. I would say this. I have lived almost 51 years as a Jew, born to 2 Jewish parents and 4 Jewish grandparents, and 100% Jewish ancestry beyond that. And of those almost 51 years, I've spent 28 years as what I call as a professional Jew, choosing to work full-time in Jewish spaces. And the last 14 of those as a Jewish education consultant under my business called Jewish GPS. I hold a master's degree in Jewish studies and a doctoral degree in Jewish education leadership. But my personal Judaism is even more important, I think, than the degrees that I hold. And I describe myself as a post-denomination Jew, as a Jewish person where I don't fit into a box of a specific Jewish movement. Sometimes they're called sects of Judaism. And I don't fit into a predefined set of observances that are normally associated with a particular movement. However, I live the entirety of my life through my Jewish lens. And one of the ways that I do that is in a personal passion, which actually led me to meeting you, is in a pursuit of interfaith learning and understanding other faiths and other peoples. And that includes, we met through a Black Jewish experience where the majority of the Black folks were not Jewish, although there are Jews of color, and also deeply involved in Muslim Jewish dialogue. So I express my Judaism, as I said, 24/7. It's how I live my life.
Wow. So again, lots and lots and lots to dig into. One other standard question I ask everyone who comes on: So, what does psychological health and safety mean to you?
I think the ability to bring one's whole self, their entire self into a space. And for me, that's not just bringing my full sense of Jewishness, although clearly important, and the ways that I express it, but it includes my personal mental health challenges, my body challenges. You and I have talked in the past about how we keep different sleep schedules than a lot of people, right? And I do have a diagnosed sleep disorder, so no early morning meetings for me. Um, right? Those are all a part of my whole self. And it doesn't mean that everybody in that space has to 100% agree with how I live out those things, but that they honor and respect me enough as a fellow human to not threaten me for having them or try to prevent me from living them to a place that I might fear that if I do express myself wholly, that there's repercussions, including emotional harm, physical harm, or employment challenges.
Wow. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I find there's a lot of conversation these days about psychological safety, especially. And I don't think sometimes folks consider all of the multiple pieces of ourselves that we. So people say, "Bring your whole self," and then, but there's a part of myself when that part shows up, it becomes an issue, and that's really what these conversations are about. Is and I'm actually at the point of telling folks, stop inviting the whole person if you're not prepared for the whole person. Let's be a little bit more specific. Here's what we are. This is what this environment is. These and then be honest about the things that you may not know that much about. Rather than these. Oh yes, we're one big happy family. We all kind of get along. Well, we're not really family, not really. And we may or may not get along all the time. And I can tell you, I have a pretty big family. We get along most of the time, but there's sometimes we don't see things the same way. That doesn't make us less family, but just because we get along doesn't make us family. So anyway, that's again, that's really the purpose of having the conversation because I would say, matter of fact, I can say that Jewish people fit into my category of folks that I consider myself an ally of, but I have no real experience of my own. The same thing I would say about women or about the LGBTQ plus IA community. I'm a supporter, but it's not necessarily my identity. So there's parts that I don't know, and that's what conversations like this are about, is to help. So if I really am interested, assuming that I'm an employer, I'm in an organization with our Jewish folks, how do we create this environment that it really is safe for real, not safe for fake? So if someone asks you, what is Judaism? How do you respond?
Well, and I think you did a great place of setting this up in your introduction. Judaism's complicated. And those of us who are in it, we understand it from everything from a faith tradition, which we may or may not adhere to certain tenets of as individuals, but it's also a civilization and it's a nation and it's a family with ancestry that is thousands and thousands of years old. It's a peoplehood and it's an ethnicity, but it also isn't monolithic, and it does have guardrails as to who is in and who is out. You mentioned, for example, traditionally of a maternal, a matrilineal descent, but there's a large swath of the Jewish population that also now accepts patrilineal descent, just as equal as it would matrilineal descent. Um, and yet there are parts of Judaism who don't accept patrilineal descent, right? So again, not monolithic at all, and every Jew comes to it and observes it and expresses it differently. But it is clear, again, who's in and who's out, like according to those guardrails.
Right, right. Yeah, and I know we well. Even though when hear myself saying words like "I know," well, I think we know some things. We all have a body of knowledge about a particular topic that we've been exposed to and that we understand, but none of us knows everything. And getting back to the whole conversation about work, it's not possible. It's absolutely not possible to create a situation that is safe for anybody other than me without the other person involved in the conversation.
Right, and I think that's something that you're gonna hear from me often through this is I can explain, in general terms what Judaism might say, or I can say, a traditionally observant Jew would practice this way, but a non-traditionally observant Jew might practice that way. And so really, you have to make each individual safe. It's not about, right, making the Jews in my company and my organization feel safe, because what makes one comfortable and able to bring their whole self may not allow another person to bring their whole self.
Yes, yes, yes. So talk a little bit about some of the historical challenges that Jewish workers have faced in the workplace in the United States.
So again, I think one is an assumption that all Jews are monolithic and that, oh, well, Sally in HR department observes this way and therefore it applies to all Jews in the company. So one is making sure that you understand that you might have to adapt for one person differently than you might have to adapt for somebody else, and welcome them in a different way. So I think that is first and foremost, I think, really important. There are a couple big things. So traditional Judaism has a set of dietary laws, uh, losing my earphone here. Um, and those Jewish dietary laws are called kashrut, or what it means to keep kosher. And they can be very overwhelming. And I don't think that the general workplace needs to understand all the in and outs. But there do tend to be three overarching approaches to the way that Jews keep kosher. One is the most observant only eat foods that have specific certification, and are prepared in kitchens also under supervision. So you can find a lot of packaged goods that all Americans eat every day. Let's call Oreos, for example, kosher, and if you look closely, you can find the certification mark on them. But if those items that are packaged under certification are then prepared in a kitchen that isn't supervised, or served with utensils or on a plate that isn't supervised, then it renders the certification null. Right? So those who are most observant may show up to a workplace where communal meals are off limits to them, right? Or where there might be a cafeteria that off limits to them. Or the next level of main observance are those who don't observe the strictest level of certification, but they will traditionally only eat vegan, vegetarian, or dairy or fish in unsupervised settings. But they'll avoid all meat products and all meat byproducts. And so there's a lot of ingredient reading and a lot of clarifications, for example, at restaurants. So if you're in charge of ordering a meal for a group of people and the Jewish person in your workplace says, "I'm happy to eat dairy or vegetarian," but you're ordering soup, well, is that soup made with a chicken stock? And if so, right, the soup is out. Right? So the last group, again, these are big overarching categories. The last group are Jews who choose to not observe any Jewish dietary laws, and therefore they'll eat anything to their liking in any sort of environment. Although a few in that category will limit pork and shellfish consumption, which are part of the laws of kashrut. But some eat pork and shellfish. It doesn't make them not a Jew. It just means that their observance and their expression is different. But in addition to year-round dietary observance, there are very even more specific ones around the holiday of Passover, which occurs in the spring. And many Jews who don't observe year-round laws of dietary need do observe during Passover to some level. Um, and so, the issue of dietary observant plays out in everything from you're having a company picnic to you have a workroom shared microwave. And depending on a person's level of observance, right, there could be issues. Or if somebody uses shared silverware and not plastic, hopefully compostable, right, to even serve something that's certified, then it complicates things. So I think it's important for workplace leaders to take time to speak to each Jewish person in their organization, in their department, to ascertain what that person's needs are, and what their observance levels are in terms of Jewish dietary. But that's a place where Jews can automatically feel alienated, right, is around something as simple as quote unquote breaking bread together, right? Which some people think is unifying, right? Can tear people apart.
So you what I'm thinking about while you're going through these things that I had obviously no idea about, but I think about when I was in the fire rescue service and we would eat together. And I can't ever recall there ever being a conversation about people's different dietary needs or even interest, one way or another. If there's going to be a big slab of meat and you're going to eat it, or if you don't, you're not a part of the clan. There's what's wrong with you? Why don't you like us? That type of thing. It almost gets imposed, and then those things end up affecting where you get assigned, who feels some kind of way about you because, well, he doesn't eat with the rest of us. I did have had a really good friend of mine who was Muslim and would not eat many things, and so he got this kind of quote unquote reputation. Well, he's not down with the crowd. Well, no, his dietary preferences and needs and interests are just different from yours. So why does that he's a great firefighter. He turned out, by the time we retired as a captain, he's a great guy. uh, but these are just examples, and I'm so thankful for you to go into that level of detail. I believe that it doesn't matter who's in the organization. When we talk about having meals together, we should have a conversation about what people's preferences are and not just assume, oh, we're going to go to X. We're all going to sit down and do Y. That may not work for everybody.
That's right, and I understand. Listen, I think our community, our culture has gotten more in shape with standard food allergies, for example, right? So if somebody says, I have a peanut allergy, or I have a soy or a dairy allergy, we've come to a place where I'm a vegetarian, for example, right? We've come to a place where we tend to offer alternatives, or we know about that. But if you have a more bizarre food allergy, or you have a religious dietary need, something the Muslims and Jews have in common, is some of the Jewish, or some of the dietary needs, right? And then, some of us feel very comfortable in our own skin and saying, yes, there's going to be this communal picnic, but I'm going to bring my own hamburgers and hot dogs, right? So that I can sit with you and be with you. But some, depending on the environment you've created in your organization, will say that doesn't feel safe to me, and therefore I'm just going to RSVP no, right? And or, and depending what city and the size city you live in, there are kosher establishments that you could say to somebody, we're going to have this barbecue. Is there a kosher restaurant I can order for you? For example, right? So I'm still going to provide it, but I'm going to provide it in a way that you can partake rather than you have to bring your own. The dietary thing, again, people I think take it for granted, but we all gather around food in such a positive way, that, to your point, if all of a sudden you're different or you abstain, somehow it changes the relationships. Um, Jewish dietary is a significant one. There are others like, the Jewish calendar, which is also known as the Hebrew calendar. And For example, a traditionally observant Jew observes Sabbath every Friday night into Saturday evening. It's sundown to sundown observance. And in a traditional observant way, there's no use of technology, or no driving, no using writing instruments, no using money or conducting business. And there are many, many other rules, but those are some basic ones. And so in America, where winter comes in early, in some cities as early between 4 and 5 p.m., observant Jews need to be able to get home at least an hour before sundown so that they can prepare for their Sabbath. And when leadership in workplaces don't understand this kind of Sabbath observance and the true need to leave work early every Friday, right, it can cause employment friction, right? Why does so, right? So acknowledging that and allowing flex time. No, that's going to happen every week, every Friday. And then there are 13 Jewish holidays in which those same restrictions apply, about no work and no driving and no technology. And so if you imagine, traditional Jews spend much of those days in prayer and in communal meals, but what if they're only given 10 vacation days, right? So now they're actually 3 unpaid days in the hole just to observe their faith. They have no additional vacation time for self, for travel, exploration, pure rest. Um, and in addition to those 13, and in addition to the Sabbath, there are a lot of Jewish holidays and observances that don't require, whole days off or have those kinds of forbid. But somebody may need a couple hours to go to a worship service, and again, some flex time, or they might be fasting, right? And so they may be a little lethargic. Um, so understanding that the Jewish calendar one is lunar, and so it floats as it is on the Gregorian calendar, um, and recognizing that Jewish employees, it could really create a problem for them, if they can't observe to that level if they choose to. So I would say I know because your next question is, well, how will I know when those holidays are? Right?
Yeah, well, it actually is. So again, for the folks out there who, again, this whole adventure that we're taking, particularly here in the US, to try to create psychologically healthy and safe spaces, there are folks out there who want to do a better job. Now, there's some people who just don't care. And for those, what I tend to tell people is just don't go work there. I mean, let's not put yourself in a situation where they don't really care about you as a person. They don't really care about your faith or your ethnicity. They don't care about it. If you don't fit in this box, and there's parts of me that get a little bit, it might be a little offensive to some, but I think you should just hang aside and say, just be honest like you used to, and say no X allowed here, because like they did back in the day, which was horrible, but it still goes on today because you say you're an equal opportunity employer until it comes down to the opportunity, until a person presents differently, until they need something. Oh, yeah, we really can't do that. Well, you hired me the way that I am. You said bring my whole self, and part of my whole self, if I'm Jewish, is these are some observances. These are things that go on. So why is this a problem now? Why didn't we have this conversation before I started? And similar to the way we do with some disabilities, and make reasonable accommodation for people's needs. So let's say I'm not Jewish, but I want to understand some of these unique kinds of things that a Jewish member of my organization may need. What's some what guidance would you give me?
Right, that's great. So again, I think the in terms of holidays and Sabbath observances, there's a website called Hebcal, HEBCAL.com. And you can even get up to the minute every week in your zip code what time the Sabbath begins. From there, you can get every Jewish holiday, major and minor. You can export it to a company calendar, downloads and integrates into Google Cal and iCal and all the things. So that's one way. And I also think, to your point about the hiring process, I mean, imagine a Jewish person who really wants a job, but they're afraid if they bring up that they're going to need flexibility for holidays, and they're afraid that they're not going to get the job they're otherwise wholly qualified for because they need some flex time around time off to observe, right? So I think during that, people really need to think about the hiring process. What questions are we asking around, again, you and I were talking about, whether it's a special need that's visible or a special need that's not. I can't do morning meetings, right? So asking me, what do I need as an employer to make this fully successful for you in terms of all the ways you learn and all the ways you express yourself, you know, and specifically, you have to ask that up front. So then again, if an employer can't meet those needs, then there's clarity around that. But also that in this case, that a Jewish person doesn't have to feel like they're going to risk employment by them being the ones to bring it up, right? And so I think that that's a huge challenge. That's a significant piece. And I think there are challenges because the HR system has said you're not allowed to ask this, you're not allowed to ask that, right? But to say, you can say to somebody, are there calendar, holiday, observances that are unique to you that we would need to know about, right? You can ask questions around that, in order to accommodate you.
But yes, yes. Well, I think this is one of the sidebar conversations that we had, is that, wouldn't it be interesting if in the benefits scheme of organizations, they said, look, we provide X number of paid days off, paid shifts off, whatever that means. And there are 13, generally 11 to 13 is really pretty common for most places. But we say, look, they're all floating. You tell us which of those days that you want off, and then the organization gets to decide. So on such a day, there's this percentage of people who are off. We're going to be not having normal operation that day. doesn't mean we're necessarily even closed, but we, because of the people that we brought in, and that might shift. You may have, you may have 5% Jewish people and 10% of another thing, and you may have all these different mixes, and that allows you. But you should be planning that way anyway, because any day, I find that a lot of the challenges that organizations have around staffing is that they are not uh, swift enough to understand that I can't be here 24/7, 365. I do need time off.
Right, and I'm not even gonna answer that remote device 24/7, 365, right? Well, and also to understand that a Jewish person may come back and say, "I'm happy to work Easter Sunday as my flex time in order to have off this other holiday. I'm willing to work Christmas Day. If I'm not a part of a multi-faith family, I'm willing to work, these other days that you automatically give off Good Friday, which has no inherent meaning to me. So I'm willing to work that day, but in exchange, I need this other holy day off so that I can be here." Um, so no question. So again, the holiday, the planning, the dietary, and then there's the things about being in a minority faith that come with microaggressions. Um, so for example, if you are embedded in a group that is pushing a traditionally Jewish view, I mean a traditionally Christian view on Jewish employees, right? With maybe quotes from the Christian Bible, which is known outside the Jewish community as the New Testament. And it's on everything from workplace walls to email signatures to in office communication channels. Prayer in the workplace is another time Jewish employees often don't feel comfortable. Overt Christianity, although we live in a country that is predominantly of Christian faith, we are a country of freedom of no religion and of religion, right? And so, which we're supposed to be, so if it's alienating to Jewish people, if it's extremely expressed, and then it even goes to feeling threatening, depending on to what level it's expressed. And I will say this: that a Jewish person who chooses to work in a non-Jewish faith-based organization, a house of worship, a social service agency, a hospital, they know that going into their employment, they're going to be entrenched in non-Jewish theology and symbolism. But that's different if they think that they're going to work at a place that make knickknacks, right? And then all of a sudden and all they see during their interview is the HR office, right? But then all of a sudden they get hired and it's everywhere in the workplace, right? It's in the break room, it's whatever. And that can feel threatening. Um, certainly living in America from Thanksgiving to New Year's is a major pit of microaggression for Jews. Um, Major pit. It's a time that can feel completely alienating, and some workplaces said, "Oh, well, we've adapted. We've changed our winter workplace gathering from Christmas party to holiday party, but we still decorate everything in green and white, and there's Christmas trees, and there's a secret Santa, right?" And for most Jews, wreaths and Santa and Yule logs and stockings and trees and the rest of their traditional decor is not secular. It gets pushed as secular, and actually, the Supreme Court ruled that many of these things are secular, but that it doesn't hit secular to the Jew in that space. It is 100% a Christian expression to us. And so, and then think about, like, is your whole music from Thanksgiving to New Year's Christmas music? Is it in your hallways and in your elevators and your waiting areas, right? It's a bombardment of all senses that can feel very alienating. Um, and I think a lot of organizations have fallen into the trap of, well, if we put up a Hanukkah candelabra known as a Chanukiah or a menorah, a 9-branched, one taller, 8 equal candle holder, that somehow we've made it equal. But the Right? We've put it up. It's in the front lobby on the reception desk, and now it's all equal, but it certainly doesn't feel that way. And also, Hanukkah is a minor holiday in the Jewish year. It's been elevated because of assimilation, um, and so its acknowledgement is appreciated, but it isn't equal by any sense. So that's
Again, another just another. I've had uh, gay guests, lesbian guests, transgender guests, and it's a very similar conversation about hanging the pride flag once a year, and like, hey,
Right? We
Yay!
did the
Look
thing.
what we've done. Yeah,
Pat
we did the
ourselves on the
thing.
back.
Check.
We did the
That's
thing. Check.
that's right. That's right. Or it's Black History Month in February. Hey, we had we had soul food in February.
Right. That one day we had a speaker come, and so we've checked the box, right? Yeah, and so I think it's the same concept of whenever you're in a minority population to really do an assessment of what the environment looks like and feels like to those who don't live that way every day.
Do you need more psych health and safety in your life? Then head over to the Flourish DX Academy for several free on-demand e-learning courses. If you're an internal professional, follow Flourish DX on Eventbrite to register for any of our free fortnightly interactive webinars. Our flagship professional practice program is also exclusively available for internal professionals. The 12-week course blends theory, applied practice, and interaction with other professionals through live lectures and a monthly community of practice session. Find out more about all these learning opportunities or inquire about a bespoke in-house training at the Flourish DX Academy. www.45003.org. Now back to this episode.
A social service agency, a hospital, they know that going into their employment, they're going to be entrenched in non-Jewish theology and symbolism. But that's different if they think that they're going to work at a place that make knickknacks, right? And then all of a sudden and all they see during their interview is the HR office, right? But then all of a sudden they get hired and it's everywhere in the workplace, right? It's in the break room, it's whatever. And that can feel threatening. Um, certainly living in America from Thanksgiving to New Year's is a major pit of microaggression for Jews. Um, Major pit. It's a time that can feel completely alienating, and some workplaces said, "Oh, well, we've adapted. We've changed our winter workplace gathering from Christmas party to holiday party." But we still decorate everything in green and white, and there's Christmas trees, and there's a secret Santa, right? And for most Jews, wreaths and Santa and Yule logs and stockings and trees and the rest of their traditional decor is not secular. It gets pushed as secular, and actually, the Supreme Court ruled that many of these things are secular, but that it doesn't hit secular to the Jew in that space. It is 100% a Christian expression to us. And so, and then think about, like, is your whole music from Thanksgiving to New Year's Christmas music? Is it in your hallways and in your elevators and your waiting areas, right? It's a bombardment of all senses that can feel very alienating. Um, and I think a lot of organizations have fallen into the trap of, well, if we put up a Hanukkah candelabra known as a Chanukiah or a menorah, a 9-branched, one taller, 8 equal candle holder, that somehow we've made it equal. But the Right? We've put it up. It's in the front lobby on the reception desk, and now it's all equal, but it certainly doesn't feel that way. And also, Hanukkah is a minor holiday in the Jewish year. It's been elevated because of assimilation, um, and so its acknowledgement is appreciated, but it isn't equal by any sense. So that's
Again, another just another. I've had uh, gay guests, lesbian guests, transgender guests, and it's a very similar conversation about hanging the pride flag once a year and like, hey,
right. We
yay!
did the
Look
thing.
what we've done. Yeah,
Pat
we did the
ourselves on the
thing.
back.
Check.
We did the
That's
thing. Check.
that's right. That's right. Or it's Black History Month in February. Hey, we had we had soul food in February.
Right. That one day we had a speaker come, and so we've checked the box, right? Yeah, and so I think it's the same concept of whenever you're in a minority population to really do an assessment of what the environment looks like and feels like to those who don't live that way every day.
As I often mention, I do everything perfectly safe for me. Because it's when I'm only dealing with myself, I know what works for me. And so if I start a business and it's just me, it is perfectly safe for the one person who's there. As soon as I bring a second person, a 10th person, a 1,000th person, if I'm concerned about the psychological health and safety of these new folks, every time I bring in a new person, we have to do a new assessment of what is it. What is it going to be going to take to be safe for them? We want their skills. We want what they bring to the table in terms of influence or whatever it is. So if we really want to make it safe for this person, we need to take the time to figure out who this again, that question, who is important. Who are you really?
That's right. That's critical. And again, that ideal of some people would say, "Well, I didn't feel comfortable asking a Jewish person about X," and I would say, actually, the vast majority of Jews would be more than pleased to have someone ask them to better explain a belief or a practice. And honestly, if they don't know an immediate answer, most of them are willing to say, "Let me call somebody who knows more because I don't observe that way doesn't mean that somebody else doesn't, but if it's my observance, if it's the way I express my Judaism, then I do know how to share that. And I would much rather somebody ask me than to make an assumption or just ignore my Jewishness. I would also say, in terms of resources, there's a website called My Jewish Learning, which is an excellent, 101, very reliable source. You can go in and type in any holiday, any ritual, anything, and get a pretty good sense of basic information. Um, My Jewish Learning does a great job of providing that information in a really layman's terms kind of a way, with links to other kinds of resources. So again, I think asking an individual, to your point, you bring in a new person, they're going to have new ways, but also knowing that there's easy Wikipedia, not always your friend. When it comes to a lot of things, right? But again, My Jewish Learning is a great resource that I could point people to.
So many of the so a psychosocial hazard being um, a psychosocial factor that's perceived or experienced by the person exposed as a threat to them specifically, that in turn causes them to behave in a different way. Not all things that are threatening are so threatening that we have to behave differently. We're aware of it, but it's there's a part of being a human being. There are hazards everywhere all the time, and we don't respond to all of them because we have a bit of we have adaptation. I mean, I know I can't be in the world and have everything suit me 100% of the time. Most people get that. However, many of the psychosocial hazards that a Jewish worker could be exposed to could actually be described as anti Semitic. So, share with us a little bit about what anti Semitism is and isn't.
Great. So first of all, I think many of our community have come to use the term Jew hatred in replace of anti-Semitism. Um, you know, right? It's important, and I think one reason is there was a pushback. Well, Arabs are Semitic people too, so how could anti-Jew be anti-Semitic? It's not specific enough. So I'm one of those people who have moved to the term Jew hatred in answering that. So Jew hatred's taken on many forms in thousands of years that Jews have been in existence. But in the workplace, it could come as simply as not being interviewed because you have quote unquote too Jewish a name on your resume, or because they show up to interview and they appear too Jewish. And that could be something is because they wear, traditionally men, some women wear a Jewish head covering all the time, right? So I show up to an interview and somebody sees that and I'm not going to get the job. Or it could be based on Jewish, visual stereotypes of, dark curly hair and a bigger nose, and you look Jewish and therefore you're not hired. So those are flat out Jew hatred, right? We're not going to hire you as a Jew just because you are a Jew. But sometimes it comes again, supervisors outright denying requests off for holy days, or purposely scheduling major deadlines or mandatory corporate events on Jewish holidays to just test somebody's allegiance to the company. Doing these things unintentionally is painful and ignorant, but that's not, if you do it unintentionally, it's not Jew hatred. Doing it intentionally is, it's painful. But if I come to you as a Jewish employee, and that means you've made the space where I'm comfortable enough to come to you as a Jewish employee and say, hey, I'm not sure you're aware that you scheduled the corporate event, the major deadline on X holiday, and you ignore me, now it's morphed from a level of ignorance to what I would perceive as Jew hatred. You've made a decision to outright offend me, even knowing that it's wrong, right? Or exclude me. And by the way, my job could be in danger if I don't meet that deadline, go to that meeting, etc. And so now again, you're forcing me to choose between living my Jewish life and bringing the best of myself to your team. Um, Jew hatred comes in untasteful jokes and stereotypes, oftentimes around money and power. Jews control the media, all Jews are wealthy, Jews control politicians, Jews control Hollywood, those kinds of things. Um, but it also comes in threatening symbols like swastikas. And I think that one, for the most part, people know is terrible. But more and more, and we'll talk about this in a bit, keffiyehs worn by non-Arabs is also a threatening symbol to Jewish people. And it comes in support of open support for Hamas and Hezbollah when people, display their logos and their flags. And, the work of Hamas and Hezbollah is to wipe Jews off the map. Right. And so when you display their logos and their flags, you're basically in alignment with that belief. So that is outright Jew hatred. And then there's symbols that are shared by other non whites, like Confederate flags and KKK paraphernalia, which also are outright Jew hatred. And I mentioned here other non whites. And that's specifically because Jews have come to understand that while we are white passing, white presenting, uh, if you ask a white nationalist about our race, we're not white, right? And so many of us check other when you're talking about racial boxes, right? So if I fill out an employment form, right, and you ask me to check my race, I'm checking other and not white. Right. And so to understand that if you come to me and you question that, and you try to tell me, no, 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 you're white, now you're crossing in again, like into some territory. Um, and I would say this again, asking questions, not Jew hatred. Asking people to clarify, asking people to share about their experiences, their beliefs, the way their family observes, not Jew hatred. Ask, please ask. Some people might say, I'm not comfortable answering that, or, and they should be given the space to not do that. But asking isn't. I will say, and again, you and I will talk about this more fully in a minute, but anti-Israel sentiment is Jew hatred, flat out. Um, and you and I are going to talk a little bit more about the brutal events and what has transpired after October 7th, when Hamas attacked Israel. But it's important to know that this kind of Jew hatred, this anti-Israel Jew hatred, has existed for 76 years in the workplace. Some workplaces not approving a Jewish employee's request to vacation if they know the person's traveling to Israel. Um, or a workplace not allowing a Jewish person to display any decor in which Israel is depicted, but they allow everybody else to display decor in their office or their cubicle, which displays that person's native lands or ancestral ties, right? So the censoring, because it's specifically related to Israel, that is Jew hatred.
Hmm. Wow. Wow. I want to believe that. Well, my experience tells me that these sometimes people feel like that the stress or the hazard in an organization is only directed to people who are not in a position of authority. So what about the leader? Okay, so the leader is a person who is Jewish, and the rest of the organization isn't. Is that chat a little bit about how that might be slightly different, but just at least in my view, just as painful in some cases.
So I think, one is, let's say you're in an industry and the industry nationally has an event, right? That's on our Jewish holy days, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Passover, etc. And now the team leader has to say either their organization doesn't participate at all, or my team needs to go, but I'm not going, or I'm sacrificing my Jewish expression and time for observance in order to go so that my company doesn't miss out on an opportunity, right? So that can certainly be challenging. Um, so I think sometimes people that are in, unless you're even the senior head of the company sometimes has to make a decision. Like, is there going to be a major event, a major merger conversation that I'm not going to be at the table because the people around me decided that it's going to be on this holy day and I can't be there? Or, it's It's going to be on a Saturday and I'm Sabbath observant, and so therefore my company and all my employees are at risk because I'm not going to be at the table, right? So I think, there's an industry issue that we don't always have control over.
Yeah. There's, but again, the what is so important, at least to me, in these conversations, is that when we decided to bring this person and this group in the room, we should be having these conversations all along rather than making the assumption that everybody here is cisgender, white, male, Christian, to go down the list of the quote unquote standard, because um, we it's difficult for those of us who don't check all those boxes to be involved in anything if I always have to be like someone else. I'm me. I'm different. And my differences are not deficient, they are simply different. So, how do we bring our best selves to this thing that we said we wanted to do, which means it may be on this day or not on that day or this time and not at that time. But if it's important for me to participate, it ought to be important enough for the environment to be safe enough for me to do it.
Well, right, and that also means that senior management needs to not be making commitments for people, date and time bound commitments, right, for the people they supervise, without talking to them first, right? Because then they're, instead of saying, "Let me go back to my team and check to make sure that this date works for everyone," regardless if it's a religious observance or maybe somebody has, a major family thing planned on that day or whatever, don't lock yourself in if you haven't checked with your team first. But I feel what happens is people open their calendars, which are already pre-filtered with Christian holidays and national holidays, and they look and say, "Nope, nothing on my calendar. Day looks great. Okay, let's make that big major life-changing meeting on that day." Right? And then a Jewish employee again either has to risk themselves by going and saying, "I'm not comfortable," right? Which says a lot about the environment in which you've created. Um, or they say something, but then now you're put in a position of either going back to the people you agreed with and saying, "I messed up," which would be great. "I messed up. I didn't realize that my team members wouldn't be able to be there." Um, you know, it's a challenge, and I think that there are things around, um, for example, let's say you have a Jewish person in management who has more time off by the fact that they're in management. So they're given 4 weeks off, right? And the rest of their team gets 2 weeks off, right? And so that Jewish person uses them, for to express their Judaism in some way. I'm going to go to a Jewish holiday, I'm going to go to a Jewish event, I'm going to a Jewish ritual thing, and I'm taking the morning off to do that. I imagine if it's not transparent, then the people who work for them will say, could turn it and say, well, they're just using their Jewish things as an excuse to not be here, or right? Oh, what, they got another Jewish baby naming to go to? Like, isn't it lucky for them? They can walk in here at noon, any day they want to, right? And that might create some animosity if there isn't transparency. So I think a Jewish person in leadership needs to be very transparent. Like, if I'm taking these 3 hours off so I could go observe this Jewish thing, this Jewish ritual, whatever, but I'm gonna put in an extra 3 hours at home between this time and this time. Please know that I'm in office during that time, and available to you, whatever, right?
And again, there should be a culture that allows that for whomever, that's flexible enough for, so whomever gets into that role, these are the benefits that go with that role, and they can do, we expect that they're going to do whatever it is that they do with that, but anybody who was in that spot would have that same opportunity because it goes with that role, and that's a decision we've made as an organization from a compensation perspective. I think most people understand that compensation ought to go along with contribution. And yes, they ought to go together, which is one of the issues I have with organizations who have people in positions of executive authority who do virtually nothing, and they make thousands of times more than the folks who actually do the work. That's another conversation for
Right,
another
that is a
day.
whole other conversation. But there's a transparency there. I think when you get into organizations that are, it's secret, everybody's, that's secret or that's not talked about or whatever, then all of a sudden you can breed discontent, and by nature of being Jewish, right? Some people will automatically link that abuse of power to somebody being Jewish just because they're Jewish, right? Even though it isn't an abuse of power, it comes with the position, etc.
Absolutely. So are there strategies that you could suggest for organizations to support Jewish workers in the aftermath of October 7th?
Sigh, deep breath. Yes. But I think, first of all, it's imperative to lay out first why anti Israel is and anti Zionism are Jew hatred. Because I think that a lot of people would stop the recording right now and say, no, it isn't. They're two different things. Zionism is a central concept of Judaism dating back to 586 BCE, which is the first time the Jews were exiled from our Holy Land. And it's recorded, this Zionism is recorded in Psalm 137. So any faith tradition for whom the Psalms are part of their canon, this is a part of their canon. And the first line says, "By the rivers of Babylon, we sat and wept when we remembered Zion." We're outside of this land and we're dreaming to be back in this land. And the psalm continues to express sheer desire to return to Jerusalem and to Zion, right? So Zionism didn't start in the late 1800s with the first Zionist Congress, and it didn't start after the Holocaust, after 6 million, estimated 6 million Jews were murdered simply for being Jewish. And it didn't start in 1948 with the UN declaring Israel's statehood. Zionism, our ancient held belief that that Jewish homeland exists specifically in that geographic place, dates back to 586 BCE. Jews are known, one of the names we call ourselves and known externally are B'nai Yisrael, meaning the children of Israel, which is derived from being descendants of Jacob, whose name in the Bible was turned from Jacob, Yaakov, to Israel, to Yisrael. And therefore, the covenant with God that includes that specific homeland as part of being a descendant. And the term is also used in Arabic, B'nai Yisrael, I'm probably pronouncing it wrong, 25 times in the Quran to describe the Jewish people, right? So, and Israel, Zion, Jerusalem, etc., all mentioned hundreds of times in our prayer, in our Bible, and other significant works in our canon. And at the end of every Passover, we gather around the table and we say, "Next year in Jerusalem," right? We talk about Israel and Israelis as us and we. We don't talk about Israel as them. So while there are Jews who will try and uncouple Zionism from Judaism, they're actually outside the mainstream of Jewish thought. And in fact, one of our great Jewish leaders of all time, Natan Sharansky, which people can Google who he is, he calls these folks un-Jews. So, to uncouple Zionism from Judaism is inauthentic. And as I said before, there are some Jews who observe Jewish dietary laws fully and some don't, but nobody's ever tried to uncouple keeping kosher from Judaism, right? Zionism is the same thing. Even if you don't feel a certain way about Israel, ancient or modern, it doesn't mean that Zionism isn't a critical part of Judaism. So I think that's important first and foremost, to just, the uncoupling is not okay, flat out. Which I think some people, I was talking to a rabbi earlier today who does a lot of interfaith work, deep interfaith work. And he was sharing about Black ministers who come to him and say, we support the Jewish people and we stand up against anti-Semitism, but Israel ... Right? And so they give themselves permission to uncouple these two things, which the vast majority of Jews cannot and will not uncouple. So that's a challenge. I also think it's important to say that Zionism, like all there is of Jewish observance and expression, Zionism isn't monolithic, right? The most stringent of Zionists believe that the entirety of the land should be 100% Jewishly settled and run by 100% Jewish law, very strictly. While other Zionists want a safe homeland where they have a right of return, so they choose to live there, but they're happy to share that land with all peoples under non-religious governance. So every permutation in between those two things is also Zionism, right? So, having said that, any words or images that attempt to declare that Israel doesn't have a right to exist as a homeland for Jewish people, that's Jew hatred, right? Holding Israel to a geopolitical standard that other nations aren't held to is Jew hatred. So, for example, being asked to not respond in defense using military when we are attacked by another military or another militia is an example of Israel being held to a different standard, right? Than America would never stand for all of New York to be taken out with bombs and under threat for 8 months at a time and 1,200 people to be, murdered in one day. Like it wouldn't, and no response, right? So it's held to a different standard. So that is an example of Jew hatred. And so when that's expressed in the workplace, it is experienced to a Jew, not as, and again, I'm saying most Jews, but those who don't, it's really they're outside of the mainstream. So, but I will say this, criticism of Israel and Israeli leadership in order to make Israel better, to make it a better place, that is fully acceptable. Jews have been doing that for 76 years, right? Americans criticize our government every day. It doesn't mean we're anti-American. It means we want it to be better. But criticism of Israel and Israeli leadership in order to make the case for destroying Israel, that's Jew hatred, right? So the intention of that criticism is the line between fully acceptable, and fully traumatic. Um, And so when you ask about, social safety, psychosocial safety since 10/7, you have to understand that the tie to Israel and Zionism is fully and wholly embedded in a Jew who shows up in your workplace. Most Jews. So, there was a survey results just posted in the last week. 85% of US Jews think it's important for the United States to support Israel in the aftermath of the terrorist attack on October 7th. The survey didn't delve into what support might look like. Is it verbal support? Is it munitions support? Whatever. And we all have a different opinion on that. But the fact that 85% of US Jews believe that the US needs to support Israel. Jews are in deep, deep, deep pain right now. We have been in a state of trauma since October 7th. You mentioned 10/7, and everybody knows what you're talking about. We are experiencing the effects of terrorism at being viciously attacked by Hamas. Babies and children burned alive, and sexual violence against women, but also against men. Bloody executions and torture. I've heard several people who say, "Oh, well, that was all debunked." No, it wasn't. It absolutely wasn't. You might have heard people say that it was debunked, but when you talk to people who witnessed it, if you are bold enough there's a lot of live camera video, not only from Hamas GoPros, but from Israeli and visitors from their own cell phones and cameras, showing people have seen the raw video, politicians and journalists and individuals. I've seen raw video. It's not debunked. It happened. Murder of over 1,200 people and 200 hostages taken in one day. So that is a trauma in and of itself. And then you add additional heartache and trauma from those who are trying to just either say it didn't happen or justify the attack as Hamas's freedom fight. It was a move of freedom and protest. So when people justify that that re-traumatizes us. And then there's that we're experiencing physical threats in the streets every country of the world as Jews. We experience it intense online, emotional, mainstream media, everywhere we look. That same study, 87% of American Jews reported that they personally have seen or experienced an anti-Semitic increase since October 7th. And 55% of those say that it's increased a lot. Over 64% of American Jews reported that this horrific event that occurred halfway around the world has affected at least one interpersonal relationship here at home. Loss of friends, loss of friends who have abandoned them, lost colleagues, loss of jobs because of their support of Israel. Statistically, 3 out of 4 Jewish college students feel the need to hide their Jewishness since 10/7. And 42% of the overall adult population feels the same, feels that they need to hide their Judaism, whether it's wearing Jewish jewelry or wearing any support of Israel or clothing or traditional Jewish garb that they normally would wear out in public. I have a friend who always wears a Jewish head covering, a kippah or yarmulke, and he just now wears a baseball hat everywhere he goes because he doesn't feel safe being out in the world presenting as a Jew. So I would say that every person in Jewish in leadership needs to ask themselves if their workplace is safe physically and emotionally for their Jewish employees. Can this person safely express their Judaism, which includes Zionism, in their day-to-day life at work? Right? Um, Jews are stunned by the sheer silence of their non-Jewish friends and colleagues. To be ignored is also to be violated. So when good people sit in silence, this is a tenet of Martin Luther King, right? Is that when good people sit in silence while their friend and colleague is in mourning, they are a part of the trauma. They are equally responsible. So simply acknowledging somebody's pain, a Jewish person's pain, and asking them how they're doing will hit very significantly right now because it's been talked about a lot in our community. People just they're not acknowledging the pain. I mean, imagine, George Floyd is murdered and that nobody who is not Black or African American or any shade of not white doesn't even respond to you, doesn't even check in on you, right? Doesn't say, I know your community is in pain. How are you handling this? What are you thinking and feeling, right? And so to be ignored and to be silent is equal. Um, and I would also say that, if a company has EAP mental health benefits, offer your Jewish employees an increased number of sessions. We are in trauma, right? If your organization has even more than a handful of Jewish employees, offer them time together as an affinity group with a mental health professional that you're going to pay for, right? Some group therapy. There are Jewish affinity groups in non-Jewish organizations right now that are struggling with each other because they disagree so vastly, right? Since 10/7. So having a mental health professional to kind of mediate that space. And also recognizing that from here on out, October 7th will be a Memorial Day for the global Jewish world. And the state of Israel has declared it on the Hebrew calendar. So once again, it's going to float. People can go to that website, HebCal, and find what the date is. But knowing what the Gregorian date is that will be the memorial for this, to offer something internal to your organization, or at the very least offering your Jewish employees time to go to a communal observance if it overlaps with working hours, being proactive and saying to them, I know on the calendar that this is the date of memorial, right? Those are some right off the top of the bat, basic, you know.
Wow. Yeah, um, even in thinking about the conversation we would have, uh, I it's difficult. It's difficult knowing, at least the part that I know of the trauma of so many people, to be able to even figure out where to start. But again, to your point, it is having the conversation and asking the question that at least gets us started.
The question of how are you doing, right? That question of just, I know I know your community is in trauma. How are you doing? You as a human being, how are you doing? How are you coping? What does your self-care look like as a result of this trauma that you are experiencing? Just ask the question.
You have again, this is why it was really so important to have this conversation with you specifically. I have not met anyone with a depth of understanding of anything that we call a faith tradition. That's kind of how these get connected. I've not met anyone with such a deep understanding of it, and I couldn't think of having this conversation with anyone other than you. So as we bring this to a wrap, um, two things in one. One is, how are you doing? And the other is, how, uh, if folks really they want to learn more from someone like you, how can they get in touch with you? So the first is that question to you.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And the last time you asked me that, I burst into tears. So I'm gonna try not to do that this time. And I burst into tears because because it's touching, not out of because it's received with such heart. I'm struggling. I'm struggling to understand, will Jews ever be safe in this world in my lifetime? I don't think so. The way they were as I was growing up, I don't think so. Um, I I am uh my work requires me to work with Jews across all spectrums who have very different held beliefs about how Israel should be protecting itself or how Israel should be responding. And so, um, to try and my own personal views are incredibly shaped by the work I've done in Muslim Jewish experiences, Muslim Jewish text study, Muslim Jewish dialogue. I'm involved in a group that is co-run, co-founded by a Muslim Palestinian and an Orthodox Jewish settler, and it sits in the disputed West Bank, and I'm very involved with them in their work. And so my personal views um, are complicated. And so I struggle every day to take in information. I said to somebody the other day, is like, I have to synthesize information that makes me frustrated with Israel, but that it goes back to, it doesn't make me love Israel less. It makes me want to make Israel better. Right. But that doesn't mean I don't cry when I know that there are innocent civilians in lots of places that are in danger, right? And so I see the loss of life and the loss of livelihood and the loss of home and of normalcy, and I cry for that. Um, and Jewish college kids on campuses being attacked, and I cry for them, right? So I am struggling, um, but I'm also determined to try to make this world a better place. So I'm happy to have lots of different kinds of conversations. I would say that anybody who wants more information, to talk to people, me specifically, my website is jewishgps.online. There are many ways to get in touch with me there, on my contact page, social media, email, setting up a calendar appointment. I would also say that, again, I come from a post denomination perspective, not just on traditional Jewish matters of observance, but also on Zionism. Um, and so I'm able to hold space within the spectrum of Zionism, right? That is wide, very wide for Zionistic belief. Um, and so if somebody wants to understand more about that spectrum, right? Um, I, I'm happy to facilitate that as well. So, but deeply thank you for asking me how I'm doing.
Sure, sure. Well, I thank you so much for the gift of your time and for the depth of your responses to the questions that I've posed. I think and again, the way I look at them is, not only are they helpful for for understanding as best I can the Jewish experience, but they apply to anyone who's different from whoever the other group is. Anyone who sees himself as, and we all have things about ourselves that are simply different from other human beings. And these concepts that you talked about will apply in any situation where there are multiple different kinds of people in the room. They just will. We, thinking about people's calendars and about their dietary needs and interests and about all of these things are so important if we're going to have psychologically healthy and safe interactions with other human beings. These are just important, and I think this needs to be the way that we go about commerce, the way that we go about um, government, is that we're thinking about the whole person all the time, not just on certain dates, not just at certain times. It's all the time.
And to your point, not tokenizing, right? To say, "Oh, I talked to the one gay person, and therefore I'm making decisions for every LGBTQ plus person in my space," right? I talked to the one the one Muslim in my space, and therefore I'm making decisions for all Muslims in my space. And so, that very individual whole self. And I think you're right. It doesn't matter. But it's important work that, people in leadership and human resources need to invest the time in the individual, in the whole self,
Absolutely, absolutely. Yes, and and again, as we close, I emphasize that the people who have a role around safety should be thinking about this as well, because this is a real safety issue for people. People who don't feel safe cannot be safe in whatever space we're in. And that's what this is about, is creating spaces where people feel that they are safe, and then they're able to express their whole self and bring all of their gifts and talents to whatever it is that we have decided that we want to do. So again, thank you so much, so much. And so, to my audience, if you are watching or listening to this podcast for the first time, welcome. Hopefully you've heard something that'll bring you back next time. Previous episodes of the podcast can be found at psychealthandsafetyusa.com. You can watch, like, subscribe, and share the podcast on the Flourish DX YouTube page. And please do join the Psych Health and Safety USA movement by connecting and becoming a subscriber on LinkedIn. Until next time, stay tuned and look out for the next episode of the Psych Health and Safety USA podcast. Tune in each week for new episodes of the Psych Health and Safety USA podcast. If you have a story or know of one that needs to be told, reach out to us on LinkedIn or send an email to david@id2-solutions.com, or go to the Flourish DX website at flourishdx.com. We'll see you next time.